Yo, students, let's kick it. Alright, stop. Push play and listen. Mr. Cooper's back with a brand new lesson. Something grabs a hold of me tightly, learning all the time, daily and nightly. Will the learn ever stop? No. Turn on your brain and let's go to the extreme. I rock the mic like a teacher. Turn your brain on and let's turn up your speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this video lesson give you some tips about making parts when we're doing 3D modeling, how to make parts, like where to start. That's one of the trickiest things to figure out is where do we start? If we're going to make some parts, what do we start drawing first in our 3D modeling program? What do we do first? So this is my big tip for you. What I want you to imagine is imagine a part that you're going to make. Let's just pretend, let's just use an example of something here. Let's just say you're going to make a battery. A 9-volt battery. Let's pretend you're going to make this on Autodesk Inventor, or let's pretend you're going to make this out of clay. So that's what I want you to think about. If you're going to make something on Autodesk Inventor or with 3D modeling, pretend you're almost making it out of clay, and what would you have to be doing to make this out of clay? So think of the shapes. That's one of the first things you need to think about, is think about what's the main shape of the object. So what's the main shape of this battery? I would say the main shape of this battery is a rectangle. It has some rounded edges, so that's something that we can do as well in our program. And then there's a couple shapes added on top. So if I were to make this shape out of clay, I would not start with these little pieces. I would start with the main thing, the main base of this piece, this part. So I'd start with making this rectangle, and then I'd add the parts on top of it. So that's just a little example there. And another thing I want you to think about when you make stuff out of clay, it's kind of like you start with a main base, and then you add parts to it. So that's one strategy. You start with a main base, add parts to it, or you can actually start with a big chunk, and then you can cut away from it. We can do both of these things with our 3D modeling program. So what your job is to do is to problem solve and figure out how to make some of these different shapes. And are you going to start with a main shape and add to it? Are you going to start with a big shape and cut away from it? Or you can actually do both as well. So let's look at a couple different items and objects. Let's think about shapes here. A Minecraft creeper. So you think about what different shapes do you see there? If you were going to make this out of clay, how would you do it? What would you start with? And then think about that and relate that to our 3D modeling program, Autodesk Inventor. So think about the shapes. My strategy would be, is if I were making this out of clay or on the computer, is I would first start with this main torso part, which is a big rectangle. And then we also have a square up top, and then we also have some rectangles on the bottom there. So I would start basically just adding those rectangles together. But I would start with this shape first and then add to it. Think about this now. So our next shape, and this is a NES, so Nintendo Entertainment System controller from the early 80s. So think about this. How would you make this out of clay? Where would you start? And then think about, relate that again to our 3D modeling. What would you start with? How would you make this? So think about that. What shapes do you see? So my strategy, excuse me, my strategy for making this would be the main shape that I see is I see a big rectangle here. This is a rectangle. There's some rounded corners, so again, that's something that we could do in our program, or if we were making it out of clay. And if I was making this out of clay, and it would then, after I make the base, this big rectangle part, is I then add these other buttons. This is a cylinder. This is a cylinder. They're short, stubby cylinders. Then we have some buttons here, and then we have this D-pad, which is, if you think about it, this is a rectangle this way, a rectangle this way, or it could be a square with these sections cut out. And that's where I'm saying, you're the problem solver. There is some creativity in how you solve the problems here. So again, I would start for this shape, and then same thing if I was 3D modeling it, I'd start with the rectangle, and then I'd add the parts on top of it. Let's look at a couple shapes of things in real life. How about a wrench? So again, what would be your strategy to make this? What shapes do you see? What would you start with? Those types of questions. What shapes do you see? What would you start with? What would be your strategy if you were going to make this wrench on Autodesk Inventor or out of clay? So what I would see here, there's a main rectangle right here. This is a rectangle. Rectangle. Nice long skinny rectangle. And then there's a circle end, an inner circle here, and an outer circle here. And then, yes, it's a little bit of a more complicated circle there in terms of it's got teeth in a way. And then also then this is a crescent side here. So this is again a little bit more complicated shape. This is an arc. We have an arc here and an arc here, and then straight line, arc. So that's where we need to be thinking about as 3D modelers is what are the shapes that we see and how we make this stuff. Let's do another one. How about a joystick from an arcade machine? Is what would be the main shape? How would you start if you're going to make this out of clay? What's your strategy? How are you going to make this? What are the main shapes that you see? What would you start with? Would you add or would you cut away? For this, now what I would do is, to me, the main shape, the main part of this is this base. This base part is basically like a rectangle, or kind of like a rectangular box. And then there's a little thin section on top. So I would start making the rectangular box. I'd put the thin section on top, cylinder, and then a really stubby cylinder on top, and then a skinny cylinder, and then there's this shape here, which is a cylinder that gets wider towards the top, and then half a sphere on the top of there. What we have to be careful with is when we're first learning, it's okay to make this as one part, but in real life, think about how many parts this is. This is one part, that's another part, the shaft is another part, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. So like there's way more than 6 parts in here, but the idea is eventually what you're going to get to the what you're going to eventually be able to do is make all these different parts separately and then combine them in assembly. But today we're not too worried about that. How about a sriracha bottle? What are the shapes that you see? How would you start making this? You're going to make this out of clay. How would you start? You're going to make this on the computer. How would you start? My thought is the main section is a cylinder. So what I would do is I would start with making a cylinder, and then I'd add these other parts on top of it. Let's do one more. How about a Wii remote? Think about the main shape you would start with. I'm not going to tell you my answers, what I think about this one yet. That'll be in the next lesson. Thanks for watching.